We are in Kaplankaya on the southwestern coast of Turkey for our annual gathering Harvest series. Here we bring together some of the greatest minds with expert speakers, renowned practitioners and talented performers, all aimed at opening our minds, creating curiosity and imagining a brightest future. I hope you like this interview. Today, my guest is Thupten Jinpa, a Tibetan Buddhist scholar, author, and former monk, who's currently the principal English translator for the Dalai Lama. Jinpa translates the Dalai Lama's books from Tibetan into English and serves as his interpreter during public talks. Jinpa is also the founder and president of the Compassion Institute, which offers training and education in compassion-focused practices. He is also the chair of Mind and Life Institute, which is focused on using dialogue in Buddhism and science. In this interview, we will discuss Buddhism, we will discuss compassion, and Jinpa's extraordinary life. Hello, Jinpa.
Hello, Rose.
You're a very busy man, so thank you for being with us and taking the time to do this podcast for a Harvest series.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and honor, and what a beautiful place.
Yes, it is.
On the Aegean coastline, yeah.
You met the Dalai Lama. You had met him before, but you were kind of 6 years old, more or less. You were a little boy in India in a school of refugees because your parents had to leave Tibet following the Dalai Lama's escape. When the Chinese arrived, what did you tell him at the time when you were a little boy?
So this was, I still remember it, quite vividly. This was a school for the Tibetan refugee children in Shimla, in quite a beautiful kind of hill station. And the reason why I remember it today, even today, is because it was a big thing for the school. So we were, the school was being prepared for days, and many of us children, we had to learn how to dance and sing, and it was all being decorated. So it was a big deal. And on the morning of his arrival, there were so many police security people who came, and I remember playing marbles with some of them. So on the day he arrived, it was very, very magical because there were, traditional Tibetan incense burning with plumes of, smoke coming around, and everybody was dressed in their best. And fortunately, I had been chosen to be one of the two children, a boy and a girl, to, walk beside him after, he was ceremonially received. Although I don't remember myself doing it, but teachers told me later that when I was walking with him, I asked him a question if I could become a monk. So there was so clearly there was some karma. And looking back, probably the reason why I asked that question probably had to do with the fact that among all the teachers at that Tibetan children's village, there were two monastic teachers, monk teachers, who looked really serene and joyful, and they were also the kindest. So that must have left a very strong impression on me, because among all the adults who were there, these were the two monks were the ones that were most impressive. Okay. So probably I just wanted to be like them, You're 6-year-old. Yeah. Apparently I asked him a question, and he said, well, if you study hard and study well, you can become monk anytime. So that was the response he gave, yeah. But the other child who was walking with him apparently asked him, when will Tibet become free? So he was probably thinking more bigger way. I was thinking just about myself.
You mentioned that you wanted to give a voice to people back home. Is it what drives you?
Well, in my own work, one of the key things that I do is, given my own academic background in classical Tibetan Buddhist training, and now with the Cambridge education, one of the areas where I can be most effective is in the preservation of the culture and, kind of revitalization and modernization, so that the intellectual, textual, and philosophical culture remains alive. So I do a lot of re-editing, reformatting of the key classical texts so that they are much more user-friendly, and I write introductory essays to these volumes so that the students and scholars can use them in a much more efficient way. So I'm trying to do a lot of things that can really help the younger generation, the newer generation, to be able to continue to maintain the knowledge of these key texts and the living traditions that are part of it. So that's, and, of course, we have the Central Tibetan Administration in India, which is our government in exile, which will do all that political lobbying. And we have various, Students for Free Tibet movements and, Tibet support groups across the world. So they are the ones who are going to be doing the more politically oriented kind of lobbying and, advocacy work. But my own work is primarily aimed at preserving the intellectual and cultural literary traditions. Yeah.
You're also very interested in the science. How do you navigate between Buddhism and science?
Well, my interest in science really came primarily because of the Dalai Lama's interest. When I was young, in India, studying in the monastery, I was more interested on the Western side, literature and psychology. I wasn't that keen on and philosophy, but not keen on science. But His Holiness has been very keen on science from a very young age, and once I became his translator, I realized that a large part of his work is actually conversations with scientists. So I had a big learning curve to catch up with my own science education. And then, of course, I began way more interested. But Buddhism and science, one interesting thing is that at the kind of, conceptual and philosophical level, Buddhism and science are actually quite close.
Okay, because usually religion and science are not the best friends in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Especially the history of religion and science in the West is not a happy one. It's quite, tricky. When it comes to Buddhism, first of all, for example, science ultimately is a materialistic philosophy, because science wants to explain everything based on matter. And one of the key, kind of foundational principles in science is the theory of causality. Everything needs to be explained by relationship and cause and effects. The same thing for Buddhism. And science cannot invoke a higher force like God or a creator. Everything has to have a natural explanation. Buddhism is the same. Buddhism has no place for creation. There's no concept of God. Fundamental principle in Buddhism is the law of causality. And all ultimate explanations of evolution of the cosmos, human life, sentient creature, everything has to be based on a natural explanation, a bit like science. So at the philosophical level, there is not much conflict. So it's very easy. And similarly, Buddhism does not believe in an eternal self, like a soul. And that's also what makes it very easy to communicate with scientists whose explanation of human experience is primarily from neurobiology and psychology. So there are very, very few stumbling blocks.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, where there is a big difference is when it comes to the nature of consciousness, because science wants to explain everything ultimately on the basis of material phenomenon. Our conscious experience, our mind, our thoughts, our dreams, our emotions, from the scientific point of view, ultimately is a function of brain, is an expression of brain. So these experiences that we feel to be real are biochemical expressions of the brain. This is where Buddhism is very different. Buddhism believes ultimately consciousness is not material. It's immaterial. And so when it comes to the nature of consciousness, science and Buddhism is very different. But even in science, the ultimate explanation being material is an assumption. It's not really proven. So you will find among scientists who, may actually believe, like the Buddhists, that consciousness is a fundamental reality. So, and because of this difference, in Buddhism, there is a belief in reincarnation, rebirth. This is not the only life. Life, goes on. The body ceases, but consciousness continues. So this is one area where science and Buddhism will actually part company.
Yes. Okay.
But otherwise, there's a lot of synergy. And one of the things that His Holiness's main interest is not so much that he wants science and Buddhism to merge, but he's interested in science because science has a way more detailed explanation of the natural world. Buddhism may believe in a natural explanation, but when it comes to the evolution of life, for example, science has a whole beautiful story of the Darwinian theory of evolution, of selection, natural selection, and all of this, and brings a lot more detail. Similarly, when it comes to physics or cosmos, science has a lot more details about the fundamental elements of matter, quarks and particles and the natural forces that bring them together. So there, I think Buddhism can learn a lot. But when it comes to psychology and human experience, I think science is quite weak because, science is built on a material paradigm. So now, of course, science is moving in the area of consciousness, but there is a lot more richness in Buddhism because, for example, many of the mind training techniques like mindfulness, loving kindness and compassion and attention, all of these are very, very richly explained in Buddhist psychology. And this is one area where Buddhism can enrich science. So the dialogue is beneficial to both sides, And so we already see, for example, now, at least in the West, and also in India, the concept of mindfulness and the practice of mindfulness is very widespread.
Yeah.
It's in the clinical domain, it's in the leadership practices, it's now in schools, and it's everywhere. And that is one of the products.
And what's the data about compassion and mindfulness?
Well, there is now quite a lot of data. Up until now, the scientific data is based primarily on pre and post training. But now the science has matured enough to be able to look at mechanism. How is mindfulness working? And also now mindfulness-based techniques are also being adapted to specific purposes. For example, like people are trying it out on dealing with PTSD, especially among veterans, and then people are also trying it out to see if it can help with the addiction problem. Yeah. And then increasingly compassion-based practices are also being used. Now the research is getting way more sophisticated, and millions of federal U.S. government dollars are being spent on studying these because, and a lot of these funding is coming from National Endowment of Health, national, NIH, National Institute of Health funding. So it's a federal government funding because there is this understanding that if some of these techniques, mind-based techniques, can help in the process of healing, the good thing is there is very little side effects. Whereas if you rely primarily on pharmacology, like drugs, then there's always going to be side effects, And also drugs-based approach is way more expensive. Whereas,
Sure.
Like mind-based approaches are less expensive,
Yeah. And do you think mindfulness is word that is more approachable for the Western than compassion?
Yeah, they are very different though, because mindfulness is primarily a function of awareness and attention and learning to settle your mind and detach and don't get dragged into a rumination. So it's learning to apply meta-awareness, learning to be with difficult experience without judgment, learning to be in the present, in a particular way. And so it's a primarily exercising of attention and awareness. Compassion is quite different. Compassion is primarily a relational quality, and it's also, in mindfulness practice, you deliberately don't evoke emotions. Whereas in compassion practice, you evoke emotions. So it's a much more affect or emotion-based approach, which is primarily relational. And the compassion-based techniques are also tapping into our social nature, because we are social animals, we are social creatures. And, studies after studies in happiness shows that one of the most important ingredients for happiness is the social connection, quality of your connection with people in your life. And compassion-based approaches aimed at tapping into that part and nurturing that part so that you feel less lonely, you feel more connected, you feel more empathetic. And so it operates in a different way. Of course, the term compassion is a bit heavier because mindfulness has less religious connotation. Compassion for many people is connected with the religion. So and also some kind of morality. So sometimes people get put off because when you hear the word compassion, they think, I'm being told not to be selfish. So that people jump into morality. But one of the beautiful things about today is that now science has come into the picture, and there's a whole new science of compassion, and now there is a much more natural language around compassion. So you don't need to tie it to religion. This is one of the big things that the Dalai Lama has achieved. One of his main message when he was traveling across the world was to bring the message of compassion, to really show that compassion is a fundamental human quality. And he has been able to take the language of compassion out of religion, out of tradition, and make it part of human experience, everyday human reality. And now science is showing us that this empathic, social part of who we are is ultimately a very important part of who we are. So I think, but compassion and mindfulness, even though both of them uses contemplation and meditation techniques, but they are two very, very different techniques. Yeah.
And what would be the techniques for a Western who's a big beginner? What would be the first step to start to be more compassionate?
I think probably the first step is to pay attention in your own everyday life to recognize where compassion shows up. That I think is because we take it for granted. We, in our everyday life, we leave compassion only as a response. So when there is someone suffering, then it gets triggered, but we don't pay attention. So I think paying attention in your life where kindness and compassion shows up, whether from yourself to someone, or whether from someone to yourself, that I think is, and then once you pay attention, you recognize the power of that. Because when we pay attention, we will recognize that some of the most deep experiences we will ever have has to do with kindness and compassion. So then, paying attention is probably the first step. And then the second one is to see as much as possible if you can make compassion part of your conscious intention. So when you are interacting with someone, when you are, have a conversation with a difficult person, or, when you have to make a decision, I think just checking with your intention and making sure that the compassion is part of that intention. So those are very simple, practical things that people can do.
Anger, what do you think about anger? Anger is a legitimate
Sure,
emotion. If someone abuses you or shouts at you, is unfair, you're angry, how do you transform this emotion? What's the process?
I think, anger as a reaction when you are provoked is very natural human response. And at that point, it's very difficult to switch it off. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing that would be helpful is once the explosion of the anger is over, then don't just move on. Pay attention, reframe that situation so that anger does not linger or turn into a mood. I think this flexibility of emotion is probably a very healthy way, because sometimes you get angry and then you get annoyed and then it stays on, mm-hmm. and then it destroys your mood. So I think just being able to recognize and pay attention to and bring awareness to the emotion, that I think is good. But then anger can also bring energy. So and being able to tap into the energy of the anger to then solve the problem is a good one. But as much as possible, if you can avoid solving the problem with anger, because when you try to solve the problem immediately with the anger, it doesn't go well, because anger also brings blindness. You know, so because
Yes, sure.
at that moment nothing exists.
Okay.
It's just that, you know. But if you can take a step away from anger, then with the energy of that anger, you can come up with a good solution.
Wow. So that's going to be a very Western question, I think, not a Buddhist question, but how can you be compassionate without being taken advantage of?
That's a really good question. It's an important one because, you know, often in everyday life, we tend to associate compassion with just not reacting strongly, you know, just letting it go, and which is true. But compassion does not mean that you should not be firm. Compassion only means that what compassion does mean is not to respond to the person in a negative way, not to, you know, while you are responding, don't forget the humanity of the other person. So someone who's being horrible
Even if
to
they
you,
forget yours.
yeah, that's true. Actually, and you have an advantage if you are not able to, if you don't forget the other person's humanity, because even someone who is very nasty towards you, then there is this understanding that strong emotion, negative emotions, is an expression of pain. So just being able to recognize that will make a big difference, because in the end, when you are able to maintain your compassion and awareness of the humanity of the other person, you are able to respond to the situation with much more clarity. Because when anger triggers anger, then
That's a war.
yeah. Whereas if you can maintain your composure, you know, then it's, you know, because in order for anger and response, that cycle to be broken,